Welcome to the last and optional section of the intermediate React part of the course. This one is all about class-based React. So once upon a time, we used to write React components in quite a different way. Instead of using functions and hooks, we used classes and so-called lifecycle methods. Now, you will most likely never have to write a class component in your work or personal projects, but you will encounter them in older code bases. And you might even need to convert class components to function components at some point. That's why I've decided to include a section on this legacy way of writing React code. Now, if you're concerned that this different syntax will confuse you, please just skip this section for now and come back to it later, or only if you ever need to learn about these class components at your job. But if you're curious about this historical part of React, then let's move right on. So let's now create our very first class component. And to do so, we are finally going to create a brand new app. So open up your terminal or command prompt, and then npx create React app version 5, and then the name of this app is going to be classy weather, like this. So we are going to create a weather app, basically. And since it's based on React classes, it is called classy weather. And in the time while this is installing, let me just quickly show you the app. So here it is. And so we can very simply search for a location here. Let's say London, and it will then load the weather for today and for the next 6 days. So basically for the current week. And that's it. So it's a very simple application, but it's fetching this weather data here from an API, of course. And here we can also, of course, search for any location that we want. So let's say I'm in Lisbon. And so, well, it is going to rain tomorrow, apparently. And therefore also where I live, I assume. But anyway, let's now wait for this to install our application. And then once that's finished, let's meet back here. Okay, looks like that finished. And so, as always, let's grab our starter files from the classy weather. So these two, and then where is my folder? Oh, apparently I installed it in the wrong folder. So let's come here to the root folder. And there it is. So let's put that right here and try again. So I'll just rename it again, and then inside our source, let's paste these two files. And also, as always, let's get rid of all the junk files here. So yeah, I think those are the ones. So all we need are the index.js, the app, or new CSS, and the starter.js, which is coming from our starter files. All right, and with this, we are ready to open up our project folder in VS Code once again. Okay, and so let's just open up our app.js and index.js to clean up that file. And that should be it. And also clean up this file. So let's delete everything here and get started with our very first class component. So basically, back in the day before 2019, in React, we would write components not using functions, but using JavaScript classes. So the class keyword, then the name of the component, and then this class would actually be a child class of React.component. So extends, and then React.component. And so therefore, we would have to also import React in every component file. So import React from React. Okay, and then we should also export this component. Let's do that down here. Export default the counter. Okay, and so this is how we would set up a brand new component using classes. So again, using ES6 classes, so modern JavaScript classes, which extend the parent class of React component. And so this parent class gives us a couple of methods, and one of them is the render method. So every single React component that is written with classes needs to include the render method. So this render method is basically equivalent to the function body of a function component. So every single class component needs to have a render method which returns some JSX. So let's just do that here. And JSX, of course, works in the exact same way as in function components. Now what we're going to do here is a very simple date counter again. So similar to what we did, I think, in one of the challenges before. So let's just write a minus and a plus button, and in the middle we just are going to have some span with the current number. So let's start at 0. All right, and so this is actually enough as a bare bones component. And so let's try it out now by coming to our terminal, and then as always npm start. So let's wait for it. And there it is. Well, that doesn't look really nice. Let's make this like really big so we can actually see something. Also, as always, let's bring up our developer tools. And okay. So next up, let's actually add some state to our component, which works in a very different way than in function components, because here we cannot use the useState hook. So hooks are only for class components, but not, of course, for class components. That's the huge difference between the two, actually. And so in a class component, if we want to add state to a component, we first need to call the constructor method. So this one is part of all ES6 classes. And then this one receives props, and it calls the parent constructor as well by using the super method or the super function. And it does so by passing in the props again. So this is a lot of boilerplate that we have to write when we want to use class components. And so this is why basically all React developers now prefer functional components. So again, this is a lot of work and super annoying to having to write all this boilerplate that really doesn't do anything. I mean, at least not anything super useful. Okay, and so now to initialize state, we do that also right here in the constructor method. So that's because this method here is called each time a new object is instantiated from this class. And so that's just how ES6 classes work, which I hope you're familiar with, but if not, well, that's also not a big deal at all. But anyway, here we are now defining basically a state property on the current object. So the current component will get the state that we define here. So that has to be an object, and then for each state variable that we want, we need to create one property in this object. So we want to count to start at 1. And so this is yet another huge difference between functional and class components. So in class components, again, we only have one huge state object and not multiple state variables like we do with the useState hook. But anyway, let's use actually a different value here so that now we can access that here in our render method. So instead of the 0, let's actually access now this state. And the way we have to do this is again a little bit annoying. So we have to write this this.state.count. So the this keyword here will in this case simply point to the current component instance. And so then from there we read the state, and from there the count. And so in class components you will see this kind of thing all the time. It's always going to be this.state.something or this.props.something. But anyway, let's now save this, and we see that indeed our value here got updated to 5. So it's reading our value from the state now. And so next what we need to do is to then of course attach some event handlers to these buttons here to then actually update the state. So let's do that in the next lecture. Let's now learn how we can work with event handlers and how we update state in class components. So just like before, basically here we now want to use the onClick property in order to add an event handler to this button. But now where do we actually write that event handler? Well, remember how I said that this render method here is basically equivalent to the function body of a functional component or a function component. So I use these two terms interchangeably, so they're basically the same. But anyway, since this is equivalent to basically the function body of the functional component, we might think that this is where we now define our event handlers. So just like we do in functional components, right? However, that's not what we do in class components. So in class components, this render method should be as clean as possible. So it should contain as little render logic as possible. And so instead, our handler functions are defined as class methods. So let's define handle decrement like this. And so with this, we have a brand new class method. And so here, now we update the state. But before we do that, let me actually show you something that we need to do first. So let me log the this keyword, because the this keyword is necessary all the time. So we will actually also need it here. Okay, but now let's then connect this onClick prop with this handler function. And the way we do that is again using the this keyword and then handle decrement. And so again, the this keyword basically points to the current component instance, which will inherit this method here from the class definition. All right, let's give it a save. And then let's click this button. And so you see that we get undefined, or in other words, that the this keyword inside this handler here is undefined. However, we need the this keyword to point to the current component because that's how we will update the state. So we will update the state by doing this.setState and then here something. So we are going to need the this keyword. But again, it is currently undefined. And the reason for that is simply the way in which JavaScript works. So when React calls our event handler here, it first actually behind the scenes creates a copy of this function. And so then the function call is just a normal function call which is not bound to any object. And so because of that, this function then loses the binding to the current this keyword. But that's all not really important. The only thing that matters to know is that all event handlers that are called here inside the JSX will lose their binding to the this keyword. And so we need to fix that by coming here again to our constructor method. And then we basically need to override the method. So writing this.handleDecrement is equal to this.decrement. And then we use the bind method to manually bind the this keyword to this function here. And so by doing this, we basically give this method here access to the current component instance again. All right. And so if you ever come across some older React code base, you will see this kind of thing everywhere. So this manually binding the this keyword to our event handler functions. And so now if we click this button, you see that we actually get access to this object. So we can see even the state, the props that it received, and some other stuff. But that's not really why we're here. So we are here to update the state. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we do this by calling the setState method on the disk keyword. And the way this setState method works is very similar to the state setter functions that we get back from a useState hook call. So basically we can update state in two different ways. We can just pass in the new state here, or we can update the state based on the current state. And so let's actually do the second one. So by providing a callback function here, which gets access to the entire current state object. So let's call that current state. And then let's actually explicitly return the new state object here, just so we know that this is what we need to do. So we need to return a new object where the count property is then updated. So we can get the current count from curState.count, and then we just add 1. Okay, and that's it. And well, that's actually the opposite direction. So we want to subtract 1. But in any case, that's working. Great. So we just made our first class component dynamic and are already updating some state. So we're doing great progress. Now let me just show you the other way. So let's remove this. And so here we could also have passed in simply a value. So setting the count, for example, to 10 whenever we click here. So you see that works as well. But of course, here we want to set state based on the current state. All right. And by the way, notice how all the concepts behind React that we have been talking about before still apply to class components. So things like updating the state will re-render the UI and all things like that. So those fundamentals haven't changed. The only thing that's changing is that we write the component in a completely different way. But anyway, let's now just duplicate this code here to create or handle increment event handler. And then here all we need to do is to just change this to +1. And then here also attach an event handler function. So the one that we just created. So handle increment. And just like before, of course, we do not call the function, but we simply let React call it as soon as we click on the button. And so, we got some error. Well, why is that? Of course. So I just told you before that the disk keyword will lose its meaning, basically. So inside handle increment, it will no longer point to the current component instance. And so that's why we fixed that this binding right here. But we forgot to do the same thing for handle increment. So let's fix that, give it a save. And so now it should work. Yes. So never forget to do this, because you see that the consequence is that your app will not work. Okay. And so now let's, instead of just displaying the number here, display the date. So just like we did before in that date calculator. And so this kind of very simple render logic is actually allowed here in the render method. So we just shouldn't define functions here like we do in our render logic in functional components. But some simple logic like this is allowed. So we define our date. Let's just pass in a string here so that JavaScript can parse the date object out of it. So let's say we are in 2027, and then we want to set the date on that. to date.getDate. And this is similar, again, to what we already did before. So we're just transforming that to a class-based component. Right? So here you basically want to add the current state to this state. So that's this.state.count, which again is a lot of work, where in functional components, we would simply call that count, right? And so let's just place that here. So date, and then toDate string. And then let's place this here into some brackets. And that looks a bit too big now. Okay. And you see that it is working indeed. Okay. And so with this, we finish this short introduction to class components and are now ready to build the Classy Weather application. But before we go do that, let's just quickly learn all the differences between class components and function components in the next video. Now, before we really dive into class components, it's a good idea to get familiar with all the main differences between function components and class components. So, as we already know, function components are the current way of creating components in React, as they were introduced into React in 2019 with React version 16.8. Class components, on the other hand, have been around for a long time, so since version 0.13 back in 2015. Now, technically, React has always had function components, but without hooks. So before 16.8, function components were very limited and not really useful, because they couldn't even have their own state. Now, in order to create a function component, we just use any type of JavaScript function, no matter if a function declaration or an arrow function. With class components, as the name says, we have to create an ES6 class that extends the provided React.component parent class. So just like we did in the previous two lectures. So when we're using class components, we're actually using object-oriented programming principles, like having to use the this keyword to read incoming props and to define local component state, which can become a bit annoying over time. With function components, on the other hand, these things are much easier. So to read props, all we have to do is to use the received props object, and to define local state, we can use the useState hook. But probably the biggest difference between these two types of components is how they handle side effects and the component lifecycle. So in class components, we actually have special methods that were defined by React in order to run code at different points of the lifecycle. And so these are called lifecycle methods, and we will look at the most important ones throughout this section. Now, with function components, we now care a lot more about synchronization rather than the component lifecycle. And we do so by using the useEffect hook. I mean, we know that this synchronization with useEffect still kind of translates into the component lifecycle, but the focus is more on synchronizing the component with a side effect. And actually, I think it's safe to say that hooks in general are the big and the main difference between function and class components. Hooks just introduced a completely new way of thinking and of writing React applications. So the day that hooks were introduced, React development really changed forever. And if you ask me, it actually changed for a lot better. But anyway, some smaller differences are in event handlers and in the way in which we return the JSX from our components. So in function components, we simply handle events with functions that we define inside the component function body, while in class components, we have to create a new class method for every single event handler. Now, as for the JSX, in function components, we return our JSX from the function, while in class components, we need to return JSX from a special render method, which is yet another React-specific thing that you need to remember when you work with class components. So, in general, function components with hooks have a lot of advantages over class components. They are easier to build because they require a lot less React-specific boilerplate code, and they produce much cleaner code. And the main reason for this cleaner code is that the useEffect hook combines all code related to the lifecycle in one single place, while in class components, that code is usually spread across multiple lifecycle methods, which can become quite confusing in large components. Now, one of the big reasons why hooks were introduced in the first place is that they make it much easier to share stateful logic, simply by creating custom hooks. And finally, in function components, we can get rid of the annoying and error-prone this keyword, which was especially hard to grasp for many beginners. The only advantage I would say that class components have is the fact that some people find it easier to understand the component lifecycle because of lifecycle methods with explicit names such as component did mount or component will unmount. Okay, and with this pretty detailed comparison, I think we're now ready to dive deep into how class components work in practice. Okay, so let's start working on the ClassyWeather application. And let's start by duplicating this file here, and then let's call this one here the counter so that we can keep the code that we wrote previously. And so now let's delete everything from here and start from scratch. So we start by importing React from React, and then again we use a JavaScript class, we call it app, and it needs to extend React.component so that we can inherit all the things that we need from React here inside this class. For example, the render method to return some JSX. So let's actually start writing that JSX for our ClassyWeather application. So starting with a div of the app class name. And as always, you can check out the CSS file that is part of this section. And let's start with an h1 with the name of the app. So ClassyWeather. Then let's create a div with an input field. And so this field will basically be for the location for which we want to search the weather. So this will be of the type of text. And let's also add a placeholder, search for location. Okay. And now all we need to do is to export that component. And there we go. We just need to make this a lot smaller so that it actually fits our screen. And so now here we can search for any city. So just like here in this demo application. Now here in this app, we for now also want a button. So a button to search for the weather. So get weather like this. Okay. And next up, let's make this input field here a controlled element. So an element where React controls and owns the state. And so this idea of controlled elements is exactly the same as before in function components. So many of the things that we learned previously still apply to class components. And so this means that we now need to give this component state. And remember that we do that by calling the constructor method, which is a method that is available on all JavaScript classes. So this is not coming from React, but this one is called with props so that we can then call the parent component, so that is React component, by using here the super keyword. And again, we do that with props. Okay, so this is really like a recipe that you need to follow, and it's always the same. And so that's why we say that these class components have a lot more boilerplate code. So it's all of this stuff that doesn't really do much, but which we still have to do in order to make this work. But anyway, let's now define state again by using this dot state and then setting it to an object. And this one will have the location property. And let's start with a default location. So for example, Lisbon. And so now, just like always, we use this state as a value. But now that state lives in this dot state dot location. So as we save this, we see that immediately our state got added to our input field. Nice. Now all we have to do is to then listen for the change event and update the state as the user types. And so again, we get the current event, and then here we set the state. So in class components, we do this by using this dot set state, and then we pass in the new object, or at least the properties that have changed. So location will be equal to e.target.value. And so if we reload this now, then that's working just fine. And we can see that also here in the DevTools. So you see that just like before, we can see the entire state down here. The only difference is that now it doesn't say hooks, and it doesn't have here the numbers for the hooks, of course, as well. But besides that, yeah, everything works the same. Now notice that here in this event handler function, we didn't have to manually bind the this keyword like we did before. We only have to do that when we define the event handler as an outside method, which is exactly what we will do next. So basically as an event handler for the event of clicking here on this button. So let's do that. And let's call it fetch weather. And for now, we will only just log something here to the console, like loading data. And then let's also again log the this keyword here. So just so we see again the problem that we have. So let's attach that here. And so again, that is this dot and then whatever name of the method. So let's see. And well, here we have the wrong prop name. Let's just reload that. And now as we click here, we get loading data. And we also get again that our this keyword is undefined. And that's going to be a problem because we will need the this keyword here to later set some state. And so, just like we did in our counter, we need to now explicitly bind the this keyword to this method. So we say this.weather is equal to this.fetchWeather, and then we explicitly bind the this keyword to this method. So basically giving it access to the current component instance, so that then we can set the state on there. So give it a save, try that again, and now indeed we get our current component instance here. So it has our state and everything, and if we change that here, then of course it won't change here, but if we do that again, then yeah, now we have the new updated state right there. Okay, and with this we are now ready to actually fetch the weather data in the next video. So now it's time to fetch the weather data according to the user's input location. And to do that, I actually already prepared much of the code. So that's right here in starter.js. So let's copy all of this. and close that, and then just paste it in here. So before our actual component. So here we have basically a function that will get these weather icons here. So the icons that we have right here. So they will come from this function here. Then we also have this function that converts a country code to an emoji, just to make this look a little bit nicer. And then we have this function here for formatting a day. So that one will be responsible to showing the weekday here like this. But what we're interested in now is this get weather location. And in fact, all that we need is to grab this code here. So just this try catch and cut it from here. And then this function itself, we actually don't need it. So just grab that code there, then get rid of this temporary code and paste that here. Now immediately we see that we have a problem because we are using the await keyword, and so this needs to be an async function. But that's luckily for us very easy. So we can simply make these methods here async methods like this. All right, so that's looking better, but we still have a problem here, which is that we are using this location here, so trying to reference a variable that doesn't exist. So instead, here what we want is this dot state dot location. Okay, now it looks like we have no more errors. And so let's just quickly go through what this code here does. So we have this API here at openmeteo.com. So we can check that out and check out the documentation if you want. But it's basically just a free weather API. So if you want, you can check out the documentation here, but that's not necessary here right now. To use this API, we first need to basically geocode our location here into a latitude, longitude, a country, and so on. So first we do a fetch request to this endpoint right here with our location string, which will then return basically all the information about that location. And so then here we are, for now, simply logging that to the console. So the name of the location that came back, and then converting the country to an emoji flag. So just as I showed you before. And then once we have that information, we plug that here into this URL endpoint. So the latitude, longitude, and time zone are things that this endpoint here needs. And so that's why first we need to convert our location to basically this information. And so then we get the data here, and again, for now, just log it to the console. And in case there's any error, then that simply gets logged also to the console. So let's just reload. Let's click here. And so you see that it's actually working. So let's see what we have here. So first we have the geodata. And so then in the results, we have basically different possible results where we then take the first one. So here we take geodata.results and the first one, and from there we get all this information that we need. Okay, then we display the name that came back together with the emoji, and finally we have the weather data. So that's weather data.daily. And so here we have all the information that we will need to then later display the weather. Okay. Now, one thing that I want to start by doing here is to create an isLoading state. So just like we have been doing before, we want to indicate the user that we are currently loading. And so let's add a new piece of state. And as I said previously, here we now do not create multiple state variables, but instead we add them all to the same object. And so here, let's say, is loading, and we start at false. And then here in the beginning of this try block, we simply do this.setState. And so now here comes a very important part. So in this object that we pass to setState, we only need to specify the actual properties that we want to change. So here, we just need to write is loading set to false, and that will then not override the location. So it will really only update this is loading property. And this is important to mention because with the useState hook, if we updated the state that is an object, we could not do this. We would first have to destructure the current state, so like this.state, for example, and then we would mutate this one property. So basically we would have to return the entire object. But here, again, that's not necessary. So just mutating this one property, and of course it needs to be true, and then let's copy it, and at the end set it to false. So let's add a finally block here, which will run no matter if the code here threw an error or not. And then down here in our render output, let's do some conditional rendering. So this.state.isLoading, and maybe you start seeing that it is quite annoying to always type that this.state. But anyway, that's why we no longer use these components in practice. Okay, but so here we just render a paragraph with this predefined class name. And so let's try that again. And beautiful. Now we just forgot to actually change it back to false and not leave it at true. Yeah, that looks a lot better. Okay, and now next up, we also want to get this city here and of course the weather onto the user interface, which means that we need two new pieces of state. And by the way, we need to get also this new location into the UI, even though we already have it here, because sometimes it's actually different. So for example, if I search for London, so if I just type Lon, then our API will automatically assume that it is London. So here we then want to display that the weather is indeed coming from London, not just from Lon. Okay, so let's where is that? Yeah, right here. So let's call this one the display location, and it starts as an empty string, and then also the weather. And let's initialize this one as an empty object because it will later also become an object. All right, and so then here, instead of logging this stuff to the console, well, this one we actually only want to log. We don't want this one in state, but we want this display name. And so let's now do this.setState, and then of course this needs to be an object, and then display location. And the same thing for the weather. So here, this.setState, an object, and then weather, just like this. Now, okay, so let's reload here. Let's come to our components. So we have all the initial state right there. And then let's get the weather, and nice. So we get our actual weather or display location, and really all the data that we need to nicely display and render our data here in the UI. And so that's going to be the topic of our next lecture. Next up, let's actually render the received weather data. And for that, let's create a brand new component. And I will actually do that again here in the same file. So let's call this one here weather. And so it again extends react.component. And as usually, we start out with the render method, which again is called each time that the component is rendered. And then from here, let's just return a div. And then for now, let's just write nh2 weather. All right. And so now, of course, we need to include this component here in our JSX. So let's do that, and let's do so conditionally. So only when there actually is some weather data, then we want to display the weather component. So let's say this.state.weather, but this is not enough actually, because by default, this is also an object, right? And so we actually need to read some property from this, so to see if it exists. So let's for now comment this out and run our code again, so that no, we are not logging it to the console anymore, but we can still take a look at it here in our DevTools. So let's then say here, if this.state.weather code exists, so this array here, this can only exist if the weather does exist. And so if that's the case, then let's render the weather component. And as a prop, let's actually pass in the weather that we want to render, and then also the location. And here, of course, it's not weather. This is how we would do it in normal functional components. But here we need to do this.state.weather. So of course, I'm actually no longer used to writing code like this. So this is a bit of a change for me as well. So we're passing in weather and location. And so then we can receive these here as props. But more about that later. For now, let's see if our component actually gets rendered as soon as the data arrives. And yeah, so in our component tree, now we also have the weather. Now, okay, and so now let's take those props, and in class components, there's actually no easy way of destructuring all the received props. So we can only do that in each method separately. But first of all, let's actually see how we receive props in a component like this. And so let's log to the console this.props. And so if we click here now, then we should get, yeah, here it is. So here is the props object, which contains the weather and the location. And actually here we want the display location. Just like this. And now let's actually take all this data here out of the weather. So let's destructure the props, which again, we have to do it manually inside of each method here. So we cannot do that centrally like we do in function components. So props.weather. And so now let's take out all these things there. So temperature underscore to m max. And let's also rename these. So this is basically just the maximum temperature. Okay, let's copy that. We also have the min, which we will just call min. And here we are getting this error because, of course, this is this.props, not just props. Let's take also the time and let's call this dates. And then let's also take the weather code. And this one I will call codes. So codes because it is multiple codes, not just one. So these here are basically 4 arrays. And so in order to render those, we need to, of course, loop over the arrays and then for each of them render one of these components right there. So that's going to be another component. Okay. And before we do that, let's also quickly include the location here in this h2. And then let's finally do what I just said, which is to loop over these arrays. So let's create this list here with the prop name, or with the class name actually, of weather, and then we will just loop over one of these arrays as always. So in this case, since all of these 4 are actually arrays, and we will need to pass the data for each of them into the new component, it doesn't really matter over which one we loop. So let's just choose the dates. And then here we will create a day component. And for now, I will not pass anything in. And so instead, I will just create that component here first. So class day extends react.component. And then our render method. And then in there, return one list item, which for now just says day. And so let's check that. Here, let's get rid of that highlighting. And let's wait for it. And there we go. So we have one day component for each of the days. And so now let's pass in all the data that we need. So basically we need the current maximum temperature, the minimum, the date, and the weather code for each particular day. So let's start with the date, which is just the current date, then the max temperature. And so now let's come to the max array and then take the element at the current position that we are looping over this dates array. So here we also need to receive the current index, and so then use that index here. Now the same thing with the minimum temperature. So min at I as well. And finally also for the code. So codes dot at I. And finally, React also needs the key as always. And so here we can actually use the date itself, which is going to be a unique string. So if we reload that now, well, actually there's no need to test this because we're not yet doing anything with that data here. But so let's now do that. And let's again start by destructuring our props. So date max min code is equals to this dot props. And now it's time to actually use that data to render the weather. So let's create a paragraph here, first with the date, and then here the minimum and the maximum temperatures. So let's use the HTML entity for degrees, then a dash, so another HTML entity, and then the max temperature. Okay, so that's not the final version, but it should already show us something. Nice. So that's already the current weather, even though that's not really easy to understand yet. So it needs some formatting. For example, here, this one should actually get the day class. And also we want the weather code now. And for that, we will create a span, and you will see why that is in a minute. So let's just try this again so we can see what changes we need to do next. And so here we are. So this is our temperature here, which we should probably round. So like this, it's a bit confusing. Then we want to format these dates, and we want to transform these strange looking weather codes here into something meaningful. And so that's where we have all those functions for that we included in the beginning. But first, let's round these values here. So let's round this one down with math.floor, and this one we can round it up with math.ceil. But let's not save this yet. And so let's continue now with the code and the date. So for that, we have the getWeatherIcon function, which just takes in the code, so a code like this, and will then return the corresponding emoji. And we have the formatDay function. So let's now use both of them. So here we use formatDay, and here we use get weather icon. All right, so let's try again. And it always takes some time, but this time it was actually fast. So that's looking nice already. Let's just make the second one here bold, which I think I have in the demo. And then closing it, of course, right after here. And then what I also have in the original demo application is that for the first weather here, that is basically today, I want to display actually today here. And so now we need to pass in another prop here into the day component, which tells us whether this is actually the current day or not. So let's say is today. And then if it is today, it simply means that the index is equal to 0. So basically that it's the very first day component that will be rendered. And so then here we can say is today. And of course, then first we need to also destructure that. So if it is today, then here the output should just be today, and otherwise format the date. And this should be it. So let's see. And there it is. Let's do London now. And there, of course, it rains a lot more. And so we have the exact same weather as we have here, and our app now looks exactly the same. Great. So we did a lot of things here in this lecture. Let's just quickly recap, even though it wasn't really complicated stuff. So we just created this weather component and included it here in case that there is some weather data. So basically in case that this property here exists on the weather. So we pass in weather and location, and then here we destructure at least the weather right inside the render method. And if we had more methods that also needed access to these props, then we would have to destructure them again in there. Now also notice that this component here and also the day component, they both don't have the constructor method, right? And so the reason for that is that when we don't need to initialize state and we don't need to explicitly bind this keyword to some event handler methods, then we actually don't even need to implement the constructor in the component in question. And so that's why these two actually don't have it. But anyway, here then we do pretty standard stuff. So we just loop over the dates array so that we can render one day component for each of the dates. And so then we pass in the relevant date, max and min temperatures, weather code, and letting it know whether the current component is today or not. And then here we simply display all that. So these two here are basically just presentational components. They don't own any state and they just display our weather data, which was exactly the goal that we had for this lecture. Let's now remove some of the boilerplate code that we have been writing using the modern JavaScript class fields feature. But before we do that, let's quickly duplicate our file again and rename this one to version 1. So then you can keep both versions of doing things. So yeah, let's come back here to our app component and now use the class fields feature. So in JavaScript with class fields, we can basically declare properties directly on a component instance right in the class definition. So outside of any method. So basically what we can do is taking this and pasting it right here. And so with this, we can then completely remove this thing from here. And notice that here we do not need any this keyword, because this will basically simply be placed on the component instance. And since the this keyword is also the component instance, well, then that's really not needed anymore. So we just basically take everything that we want to declare on a class instance and place that here outside. So again, that's a JavaScript feature, not a React feature. And so if we now save this and then run our code again here, then you see that it still works. So it's doing the exact same thing. So that's already a huge win, but we can do even better because we can also define methods as class fields as well. So instead of writing a method in the traditional way, we can instead do this. So let's comment out this part. And so now we can do fetch weather like this. And then we can simply assign a function value to this variable. And the great thing about this is that we can now use an arrow function here. And the great advantage of that is that arrow functions do not lose their binding to the this keyword. So arrow functions don't have their own this keyword, and instead they get access to the surrounding one. And therefore, we then no longer will have to do this. So watch as I type async, and then again an arrow function. And I'm missing just the curly braces here, but that should be enough. And so now I can delete this. So let's try that. And yeah, it still works exactly the same. And so now we no longer need this. So ESLint even tells us that this is now a useless constructor. So with this, we got rid of all the boilerplate code that we had. And the biggest win by far is this one here, so that we no longer need to manually bind the this keyword to our event handler methods. So now these methods are basically defined as a normal variable, and so then using the async function, that problem that we had with the this keyword simply disappears. Now this function here is really huge, but unfortunately for us, with class components, there's no easy way of extracting it into, well, somewhere else, basically. So we cannot just remove this function from here like we could do with custom hooks in function components. So if we have a lot of long methods like this, then our components can get really annoyingly long. But again, there's not really a way around this. But I still wanted to mention this here just so you could see another great advantage of functional components. Let me now show you a quick example of child-to-parent communication, which is a very important thing in React development, and it works basically exactly the same in class-based React. So what I want to do now is to quickly extract this input right here into its own component. So let's actually grab all of this here, and then let's create a new class here. So a new component just called input, which extends react.component. And then the render method, from which we simply return what we just cut there. And then let's come back here and simply include that input. All right, but of course, then we get some errors because this input here depends on some state and on updating state, which is not living anymore in this current component. So the location state, of course, needs to stay in the app component because we need it here in this other method. So here in this fetch weather event handler. So we need to do what we always do, which is to pass in these things as props. So this data of location. And so that's at this.state.location. And then here we receive that as props. So now it's no longer this.state.location, but this.props.location. And so if I give it a save now, then we are back to working here. However, the state will of course still not update because the state again still lives in that other component, so in the app component. And so this is where child to parent communication comes into play again. So remember that basically means that a child component needs to update the state in a parent component. And the way we do that is to simply pass down the state updating function into the child component. So basically we need now this and pass it as a prop. So let's grab that and actually let's create a brand new event handler function here. And we will do it just like this other one. So just like we did in the previous lecture as a class field. So let's call this one set location. And then this one needs to receive the event. And actually it's just copy paste at this point. So let's remove that. And so with this, we created ourselves the event handler. And so now all we have to do is to pass that in also here. So let's call that prop maybe on change location and then the set location function. So actually this dot set location. So we have so many this here, it's getting a bit confusing indeed. So on change location, let's just copy that. And so now again, this dot props dot on change location. And so now we are back to being able to change the input here. But now we are doing it using child to parent communication. So this technique is just as important in class-based React as in function component-based React. So the whole thinking in React part is actually exactly the same in class and in function components. Let's finish this section with the three most important lifecycle methods, which are component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. And we are going to use these lifecycle methods to implement two more features into our application. So first of all, we want to search for weather as we type. So for example, as I keep typing, it will then search basically for different locations until I arrive at something that I want. So notice that we don't have the search weather button here anymore, but instead, each time that I type, a new search will be fired off. So that's one of the features, and the other one is, as I reload the page now, then you see that we get the exact same location that we had before. And so that's because we store this location here in local storage each time that we type a new location in here. So let's now use lifecycle methods to implement these two features. So lifecycle methods are essentially special methods that all React components get access to and which we can use to run side effects at different points of the component lifecycle. And the most important points of the lifecycle are mounting, re-rendering, and unmounting of the component. So we already talked about these before when we first talked about the use effect hook, right? Now, the lifecycle methods are not exactly the same thing as the use effect hook in function components, but they are the closest similar thing that we have in class components. And so let's now start with the component did mount method. So let's just specify that one here. So component did mount. And so this is really just another method. And as the name of the method says, this one is called immediately after rendering. So basically after the DOM has been created, just like a use effect hook with the empty dependency array. And so this is the ideal place to perform some initial side effects as the component loads. So what we can do here as the component renders and first mounts is to call our fetch weather method. Okay, and so what this will do is that as soon as the app is loaded, it will immediately start fetching for the weather. And indeed, that's exactly what happened here. Now this only works because we have Lisbon here as a predefined location string, but this is just to demonstrate how this lifecycle method here works. So again, this is not exactly the same as the use effect hook, but the closest thing that we can imagine this being is a use effect with the empty dependency array. So only running on mount, but not on re-renders. Okay, but speaking of re-renders, of course, we also have a lifecycle method for that event. And so that one is called component did update. All right. Now, what's special about this method is that React actually gives it access to the previous state and the previous props. So the first argument is the previous props, and the second one is the previous state. And so this is then a bit similar to the use effect hook with some variable here in the dependency array. For example, we can now use this previous state here to check if the location has changed. And so that's then similar to having a use effect with location in the dependency array. The difference is that this method right here is not called on mount, so really only on re-render, while this use effect would of course also be called on mount, so on the initial render. So as I was saying, we can now compare the current state with the previous state. So this .state.location, if it's different, so if it has changed across renders, then we can do something. And of course, we can also not do this comparison and not even do anything with this previous state or the previous props. But in this case, we actually need them, because now what we want to do is to again fetch the weather in case that the new location is different from the previous one. And so this will then basically enable us to search for the weather as we type. So you see, it's already working. So it's doing exactly the same thing as before in our demo app. Now, one downside that you can immediately see is that our fetching logic here is now spread across these two lifecycle methods. So we're fetching the weather on mount and also on re-render. And so then we need to call this function here in two places. Now that's not a big deal, of course, in this situation, but in real-world applications, this used to be really a big problem. So we used to have logic that belongs together spread out over these different methods. So that then makes the code a lot harder to understand. And to use effect actually solved some of these problems. Again, because this one here, so this effect like this, would run both on mount and on re-render. But anyway, we can now remove this button here, as we now no longer need it. All right, what we can also remove to make this a bit more real is of course this initial location. But this will now give us a problem, because right now on the component mount, this will still attempt to fetch the weather, even though right now we have no location. And so actually in this particular case, it doesn't make any sense to even fetch the weather as the component mounts. So I will now remove this from here, but it was still important to understand initially how this lifecycle method here works, and we will actually need it again here in a minute. But now let's just reload here, and so then we don't get that error anymore, but we still get now this error. And first that's because this one here doesn't exist. But let's try that again. And so here now the problem is that there was no location found. So this API only starts searching for something if we have at least 2 characters in our string. So let's quickly fix that by coming here into this function, and we can just say if this.state.location.length is less than 2, then just return. So then just don't do anything. And so now that's fixed. And again, as we keep typing, it will then show us the weather for those different locations. Okay, great. And now what we want to do is that feature where it will remember our location in local storage. So how are we going to do that? Well, basically each time that we type a new character here, we want to store the location into local storage. And so then once again, the component did update lifecycle method is the perfect place for doing that. So besides fetching the weather, we also want local storage dot set item. Let's call this one location. And then what we want to store there is this dot state dot location. And since this is already a string, we don't even need to convert it to a string. And so now, as we keep typing, let's check out our application tab here with a bit more space. And then indeed, here we have Faro in the local storage right now. And so all we have to do now, because right now, of course, we don't get that value yet. And so what we have to do now is to read that value from local storage as the component mounts. And so the perfect place for that is, again, our component did mount lifecycle method. So here we will want to set our state based on that data that's coming from local storage. So this dot set state, and then remember it always needs to be an object here. So with the location property, and then simply local storage dot get item from the key of location. Now when we run this app for the first time, there won't be no local storage yet, at least not with this key. And so let's then set a default of an empty string. Okay, and there it is. So let's reload here, and then that's working great. So let's just analyze what happens here. So as the component is mounted, it will then read this value here from local storage right here. So in this lifecycle method. So this then sets the state, which will in turn re-render the component. And so then after that re-render, the component did update method will get called. And so that's where we then fetch the weather, because of course the new location will be different than the previous one. But if we copy this, for example, and then just paste the same thing here, then the new state is the same as the current one. And so then nothing happened here. Great. So this is how we work with lifecycle methods in a very simple way. So just, again, some simple examples, but that's all we need right here. And now to finish, let's just take one more minute to talk about another lifecycle method, which is the component will unmount method. So this one is a bit less important, but let's just mention it here as well. Now this component, so the app component, will actually never unmount, so it doesn't make sense to use it here. So let's do it here in the weather, because of course this component will sometimes not exist. So when there is no string here, then there's also no weather component. So we can just then use component will unmount. And so doing this is very similar to returning a cleanup function from a effect function. The difference is that this one really only runs after the component unmounts. So after it disappears and is destroyed, not between renders. So again, this lifecycle method is mostly used to clean up after some effects, which in this case we don't really have. And so there's not really any meaningful thing that we can do here. So let's just log something to the console just to show you. So weather will unmount or is unmounting. It doesn't really matter. All right. So again, between renders, this is not running. So it's not doing anything. But then, well, nothing happens actually. So our weather didn't even disappear. But that's just because we probably have some problem here. So let's come back here to the function where we fetch this data. And so here, what we want to do instead is to not only return, but also just set the state to empty weather again. Basically doing return this.set state, and then the weather should basically be reset to an empty object. So let's try that again. Okay, and then now we saw that the component disappeared, and so then the component will unmount method was called, and therefore we got this log here in our console. And so this again would be ideal to clean up after some side effects that we created. So not really the case here, but now you know that this method exists and that it's one of the 3 most important ones, I would say. Now if we write again here component, you see that there are many other lifecycle methods, but these are not that important, and so therefore we will not talk about that here in this basically crash course of class components. So remember that the goal of this section was not for you to really learn how to write these class-based components on your own, but more to understand how they work and what they look like in case you ever come across some of them in your work, in case that company still maintains some old code base. So that's perfectly possible thing to happen, and so I thought it was a good idea to include this section here so that you can be prepared for that possible future. And now if you feel like it, you could actually convert this entire application back to function components. So I think that would be a really great exercise for you to practice everything that we have learned up until this point, including understanding even better how these class components work. So in case you do that, I would really like to see your implementation. So make sure that you paste something like a link to a GitHub repo in the course Q&A after this lecture. And so, yeah, really looking forward to seeing that. And then once you're done with that, or even if you don't want to do it, I hope to see you soon in the next section, which will be the beginning of part 3 of this course. So this is where we will finally enter the advanced React part of this course.